Picture the cockpit of a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka at 500 feet above the Eastern Front. The engine is screaming. The ground below is a carpet of fire, smoke, and anti-aircraft shells bursting like black flowers in a frozen sky. The aircraft shudders. A round tears through the fuselage. Then another. The instrument panel splinters. The pilot looks down at his right leg and sees nothing where a leg should be. Just blood. Just bone. Just the throttle still in his grip. He does not turn back. He does not black out. He levels the aircraft, presses his thumb against the rudder pedal, and finishes the mission. This is not fiction. This is not embellishment. This is a documented record of one man, one single, extraordinary, terrifying, impossible human being who flew more combat missions than any other pilot in the entire history of aerial warfare, not just in World War II, in all recorded military history. His name was Hans-Ulrich Rudel, and even the people who loved him thought he had lost his mind. To understand why Rudel matters, you have to understand what the Eastern Front actually was. Most people in the Western world learn about World War II through the lens of Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, the Pacific Campaign. These were enormous, history-defining conflicts. But the Eastern Front, the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, was something of an entirely different magnitude. It was, by every measurable standard, the largest, bloodiest, most mechanically destructive military confrontation in the history of human civilization. Between June 1941 and May 1945, the Eastern Front consumed approximately 30 million Soviet lives. The Germans lost over 5 million soldiers on that single theater alone. The land itself was transformed. Rivers ran red. Entire cities were reduced to ash and rubble. Forests were stripped bare by artillery fire, and the soil of Ukraine, Belorussia, and Western Russia was churned so deeply by tank tracks and shell impacts that it looked from the air like the surface of the moon. At the heart of German tactical air operations on this front was the Junkers Ju-87, universally known as the Stuka. The name came from the German word Sturzkampfflugzeug, dive bomber, and that word barely captures what the aircraft was designed to do. The Stuka was built for precision destruction at low altitude. It would peel away from formation, point its nose almost straight down, scream toward the earth at speeds exceeding 370 miles per hour, release its bomb at close range, then pull out of the dive at the last possible second. The pilot would experience forces up to 6 times the weight of gravity during that pullout, enough to gray out vision, enough to burst blood vessels in the eyes, enough to render an average man unconscious. The Stuka also had fixed landing gear and a distinctive bent wing that made it aerodynamically stable in the dive, and it had, by design, by deliberate psychological engineering, sirens mounted on its fixed undercarriage, wailing sirens that screamed louder as the aircraft dove faster. The Germans called them Jericho-Trumpeten, the trumpets of Jericho. The sound was designed to terrify. It worked. Soldiers on the ground, even veteran soldiers who had seen years of combat, would break and run when they heard that sound descending from the clouds. By 1942, however, the tactical landscape had changed dramatically. The Soviet Union had recovered from the catastrophic opening losses of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of June 1941. In the first weeks of Barbarossa, the Soviets had lost entire armies, encircled, destroyed, captured by the hundreds of thousands. The Wehrmacht had moved with a speed and ferocity that seemed almost supernatural. Entire Soviet tank armies were wiped out before they could even fully mobilize. German armored columns had driven hundreds of miles in days. But by winter 1941, the offensive had stalled. The Soviets had traded space for time, absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other nation, and were now feeding fresh armies, including armies equipped with a T-34 tank, into the grinding machinery of the front. The T-34 was a revelation. It had sloped armor that deflected most German anti-tank rounds. It had wide tracks that handled snow and mud where German tanks bogged down. It was fast, relatively simple to manufacture, and it was being produced by Soviet factories in the Ural Mountains. Factories that had been physically dismantled, transported east by rail beyond the reach of German bombers, and reassembled in the middle of winter by workers who slept at their machines because there was nowhere else to sleep. The Soviet armor problem was becoming existential for Germany. By 1943, the Soviets were fielding T-34s by the thousands. German anti-tank doctrine was struggling to keep pace. Their 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns, effective in 1940, were increasingly useless against Soviet armor. And the Soviet commanders had learned, painfully, at enormous cost, how to use their tanks in coordinated mass assaults. Into this equation stepped the Stuka, and with it, the man who would redefine what one human being could achieve in the air. Hans-Ulrich Rudel was born on July 2, 1916, in Konrad-Swaldow, a small village in Silesia, a region that was then part Germany and is today in southwestern Poland. His father was a Lutheran pastor, a quiet, serious man of deep faith and deeper moral conviction. Rudel grew up in a household where discipline, duty, and the strength of personal character were treated not as abstract values, but as daily practices. He was expected to work hard. He was expected to endure. He was expected to finish what he started. As a young man, Rudel was not, by any conventional measure, exceptional. His early academic performance was unremarkable. His instructors at various schools found him average to middling. He was not the sharpest student in the room. He was not the most charismatic. He was not the one you would have pointed to and said, "That boy will change history." What he was, from his earliest years, was relentless. Rudel became obsessed with physical fitness in his teenage years in a way that bordered on the fanatical. He ran, he cycled, he swam, he skied, he pushed his body with a kind of methodical, almost scientific determination, not because he was trying to impress anyone, but because physical capability to Rudel was a form of moral character. Your body was a tool. Your tool had to be maintained. Your tool had to be sharpened. Every day that you allowed yourself to be soft was a day wasted, a day of personal failure. He did not drink. He did not smoke. While other young men in his social world were enjoying the freedoms of German interwar youth culture, the cafes, the parties, the slow drift toward adulthood, Rudel was running another 10 kilometers before dawn. When he joined the Luftwaffe as a cadet in 1936, his initial assessment was not promising. He was evaluated as unsuitable for fighter pilot training, not aggressive enough, not instinctively gifted enough in the air. This was an assessment that would prove, in retrospect, to be one of the most spectacularly wrong evaluations in military aviation history. But at the time, it stung. Rudel was shuffled toward reconnaissance flying. Important work, useful work, but not the sharp end of the spear, not the fire and the glory. For a man of Rudel's internal drive, it felt like being given a desk job while the war started without him. He watched the fall of Poland in September 1939 from a distance. He watched the fall of France in 1940. The astonishing, almost incomprehensible 46-day collapse of one of the great military powers of Europe. From the sidelines, flying reconnaissance missions, seeing the aftermath but never the action. The frustration ate at him. He had not built his body, had not disciplined his mind, had not given everything to the Luftwaffe to spend the war taking photographs. He transferred to Stuka units and began flying the Ju-87 operationally as Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest military operation in the history of the world. 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossing into Soviet territory on a front that stretched nearly 2,000 miles from the Arctic to the Black Sea. Rudel was 24 years old. He had found his airplane. He had found his war. And in a way that nobody, not his commanders, not his colleagues, not even Rudel himself, could have fully anticipated, the war had found exactly the man it needed. In the early weeks of Barbarossa, Rudel flew with the intensity of a man making up for lost time. The Stuka units were operating from primitive forward airfields, strips of flattened grass or compacted earth carved out of farmland, sometimes so close to the front that you could hear artillery fire from the flight line. The pace of operations was punishing. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day. Aircraft were refueled and rearmed while the pilot was still in the cockpit. Mechanics worked through the night. Engines were pushed past their rated hours because there was no time to rest them. Most pilots flew 3, maybe 4 sorties on a maximum operational day. Rudel flew 8. On certain extraordinary days, he flew more. His ground crew, the mechanics, the armorer, the men who kept his aircraft in the air, began to look at him with a mixture of awe and genuine alarm. Who was this man? Did he sleep? Did he eat? Did he feel fatigued the way normal human beings felt fatigue? The answer, apparently, was no, or at least not in any way that translated into stopping. Rudel was not flying recklessly. This is an important distinction. There is a difference between courage and stupidity, between aggression and suicidal indifference. Rudel was, above all else, a professional. He studied his targets. He calculated his approach angles with precision that bordered on mathematical obsession. He understood the physics of the dive, how the wind changed at different altitudes, how the airspeed affected bomb release timing, how the pullout had to be timed to the fraction of a second to avoid flying through his own bomb fragmentation. He was not brave in the sense of ignoring danger. He was brave in the sense of calculating danger, accepting it, and proceeding anyway because the mission required it. And then came the moment that transformed Hans-Ulrich Rudel from a very good pilot into a legend. It was September 23rd, 1941. Rudel was briefed on a mission that his fellow pilots considered suicide. The target was a Soviet battleship Murat, anchored in the Kronstadt naval base, the heavily defended harbor of Leningrad, protected by layers of anti-aircraft guns, fighter cover, and the simple physical fact that a battleship is one of the hardest targets in the world to hit from the air. The Murat was a dreadnought, a vessel of enormous power and symbolic importance to the Soviet Navy. She displaced 23,000 tons. Her hull was reinforced steel. Her anti-aircraft armament was formidable. Previous attacks on Murat had failed. German aircraft had attacked the base and been driven off by the wall of flak and fighter defense. The Soviets knew the Germans were coming. They were ready. The idea of sending a slow, vulnerable Stuka, an aircraft with maximum speed of only 255 miles per hour in level flight, into that environment was, in the assessment of most experienced military aviators, a death warrant. Rudel volunteered. He was assigned a single 1,000-kilogram bomb, approximately 2,200 pounds of high explosive mounted beneath the fuselage of a Stuka. This was the maximum bomb load the aircraft could physically carry, and it changed the handling characteristics significantly. The aircraft was heavier. The dive was faster and harder to control. The pullout required even greater physical strength and was even more likely to induce blackout. Rudel rolled into his dive over Kronstadt. The flak came up in sheets. The air around his aircraft became a geometry of smoke and steel. Soviet fighters were in the area. The Murat was directly ahead and below, growing his bomb sight with terrible, hypnotic speed. He held the dive. He held it past the point where his colleagues would have released. He held it to an altitude that exposed him to the full fury of the ship's own defensive armament, to the risk of flying into the surface of the water, to the edge of physical blackout from the forces his body was now experiencing. He released. The 1,000-kilogram bomb struck Murat directly. It penetrated her deck plating. It detonated in or near her forward ammunition magazine. The Murat exploded. The forward section of the ship was destroyed in an enormous detonation that sent a column of smoke and fire hundreds of feet into the air. The battleship settled and partially sank, her forward superstructure destroyed. Her operational career as a capital ship effectively ended. Rudel somehow flew home. He was 25 years old. He had just done what no other pilot had managed. He had sunk a battleship from a Stuka with a single bomb in the middle of the most heavily defended naval base on the Baltic coast. And he was not finished. He was barely started. The years that followed were a relentless accumulation of the extraordinary. As the Eastern Front ground from its initial blitzkrieg phase into the attritional hell of siege warfare, city fighting, tank battles of incomprehensible scale, and partisan operations across thousands of square miles of occupied territory, Rudel flew. He flew through everything. He flew in weather that grounded other units. He flew on days when the maintenance officers declared aircraft unserviceable. He flew when he was sick. He flew when he was exhausted. He flew after being shot down. He flew after being wounded. He flew as if stopping was not a concept his mind was capable of processing. By mid-1943, he had completed over 1,000 combat missions. 1,000. To put this in perspective, the average Luftwaffe pilot who survived the Eastern Front completed somewhere between 1 and 200 missions before being rotated out of frontline duty reassigned to a training role, or killed. 1,000 missions was a number so far outside normal parameters that it had ceased to be a statistic and had become something closer to a philosophical statement about human limits. Rudel's commanders were simultaneously awed and terrified. They tried to pull him back. They tried to reassign him to training roles, to staff positions, to anything that would take him out of the cockpit and preserve what had become a symbol, a living, breathing, impossibly durable symbol of German military capability. They sent orders from above. Rudel acknowledged the orders and went back to his cockpit. He developed a specialty that would define the second half of his combat career. The Soviet T-34 tank problem, which had been acute in 1942, had become critical by 1943. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in the history of warfare, involving approximately 6,000 armored vehicles on both sides, the Wehrmacht discovered that conventional anti-tank weapons and tactics were increasingly inadequate against Soviet armor en masse. Something had to change. Something had to evolve. Rudel, working with aircraft designers and ordnance engineers, helped develop a modified Stuka, the Ju-87 G1, that carried not bombs but a pair of 37mm Flak 18 cannons mounted in underwing pods. These guns fired tungsten-cored rounds capable of penetrating tank armor from above. The key insight, Rudel's insight, developed over hundreds of actual combat missions rather than in a design office, was that the top armor of Soviet tanks was thin. The designers and engineers had focused on front and side armor because that was where conventional anti-tank rounds came from. But from the air, attacking from the rear and above, a pilot with an accurate gun could destroy a T-34 with a handful of 37mm rounds to the engine compartment or the thinner deck plating. This was not theoretical. Rudel proved it himself repeatedly in combat. By the war's end, the documented, officially confirmed record of Hans-Ulrich Rudel's individual tank kills stood at 519. 519 tanks. This number is staggering in isolation. In context, it is almost incomprehensible. An entire American or Soviet armored division contained somewhere between 150 and 200 tanks. Rudel, by himself, from the cockpit of a modified Stuka, destroyed the equivalent of 2.5 full armored divisions. In addition to the tanks, he destroyed over 800 vehicles of various types, more than 150 artillery pieces, 70 landing craft and numerous bridges, supply depots, and field fortifications. He shot down 9 Soviet aircraft in air-to-air combat. Remarkable for a pilot whose aircraft was not designed as a fighter, the Soviets knew his name. They feared his name. Soviet commanders issued specific orders to their anti-aircraft units. When certain Stuka appears, do not engage other targets. Focus everything on that aircraft. Bring it down at any cost. They assigned fighter escorts to patrol areas where Rudel was known to operate. They raised the anti-aircraft density in sectors he frequented. They put a bounty on his aircraft, and none of it was enough. He was shot down and forced to land or bail out. 30 times over the course of the war. 30. The average pilot who was shot down once had a roughly 50% chance of surviving the experience. 30 times. And Rudel walked away from every single one. Sometimes he walked away literally, landing in enemy territory, evading capture on foot through frozen forests or over frozen rivers, returning to German lines through sheer stubborn refusal to be a prisoner. He was wounded multiple times. Shrapnel, bullet wounds, injuries from crash landings. He flew through all of it. He absorbed damage that would have hospitalized most men for months, submitted to the minimum treatment required to keep him functional, and went back. And then, on February 9, 1945, the Eastern Front came for him in a way it had not come before. By February 1945, the war was unmistakably, catastrophically lost for Germany. The Soviet offensive that had begun on January 12th, Operation Vistula Oder, had shattered German Army Group A with a violence and speed that shocked even Soviet commanders. In 11 days, Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces had advanced 300 miles, destroying whatever German forces stood in their path. Soviet armor was now less than 40 miles from Berlin. German cities were burning. German civilians were fleeing westward in the freezing winter, millions of them streaming along roads choked with ice, snow, and the debris of a collapsing nation. Rudel was flying close air support, as he had been flying relentlessly through 4 years of war. He was attacking Soviet armored columns pressing toward the German lines near the Oder River. The weather was brutal. The anti-aircraft fire was dense. The Soviets by this point had enormous concentrations of AAA guns protecting their armored spearheads, having learned over 3 years of war exactly how much damage one Stuka pilot could do to an armored column. A round, almost certainly from a heavy-caliber anti-aircraft gun, struck Rudel's aircraft and tore through his right leg just below the knee. The leg was essentially destroyed. The bone was shattered, the major blood vessel severed, the tissue devastated. In clinical terms, it was an amputation wound. His leg, attached by damaged tissue and nothing more, was still his boot, still pressed against the rudder pedal, but it was no longer a functional limb. The pain that would have rendered most human beings immediately unconscious from shock, was, by Rudel's own later account, immense. He did not lose consciousness. He did not immediately divert. He pressed a mangled remnant of his leg against the rudder pedal. Using the stump, using the pain, using whatever neurological and physiological resources he had left, and he completed the attack run. Then, and only then, did he turn the aircraft toward home. His rear seat gunner, a man named Ernst Gaterman, who was also Rudel's personal physician, an arrangement that makes a certain dark logical sense in retrospect, applied a tourniquet in flight. Rudel was losing blood rapidly. He was going gray. The aircraft was losing altitude. The airfield, when he reached it, seemed to swim in and out of clarity. He landed the aircraft. He did not crash it. He put it down on the airfield with a controlled, deliberate landing. A man with one functional leg and massive blood loss, and probably enough adrenaline in his system to fuel a small engine. And then he allowed them to take him out of the cockpit. The leg was amputated. The surgeons did what the anti-aircraft shell had started. 6 weeks later. 6 weeks. Rudel was back in a cockpit. He had been fitted with a prosthetic lower leg. He had adapted his flying techniques to compensate for the absent limb. And he had walked, on a prosthetic, through snow and pain and the sheer force of a will that seemed to operate on principles the rest of humanity was not entirely familiar with, back to his squadron. His commanding officers despaired. Adolf Hitler himself, who had taken a personal interest in Rudel, who had decorated him personally on multiple occasions, who had forbidden him from flying after previous injuries, issued a direct order that Rudel was not to fly combat missions. Rudel returned to his cockpit. He flew. He attacked Soviet armor. He was hit again. He continued. Between the amputation of his leg in February and the end of the war in May 1945, a period of approximately 3 months, Hans-Ulrich Rudel flew an additional 500 combat missions on a prosthetic leg. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Hans-Ulrich Rudel flew his last mission on May 8th. He did not surrender to the Soviets, a decision that, given the documented Soviet hostility toward him personally, was probably the only option that preserved his life. He flew his Stuka west and landed at Kitzingen Airfield in Bavaria, surrendering to American forces. When the Americans processed their new prisoner, they found themselves in the unusual position of not entirely knowing what to do with him. Rudel was the most decorated German serviceman in history. He was the only recipient of the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross with golden oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, a decoration created specifically for him, because existing decorations had simply run out of categories adequate to what he had done. He was a man who had, by official record, accumulated a combat record that no human being before or since has replicated. He was also, by this point in history, associated with a regime of extraordinary evil, and this is where the story of Hans-Ulrich Rudel becomes genuinely complicated, where the documentary obligation to historical truth requires acknowledging that extraordinary individual capability does not exist in a moral vacuum. Rudel was, politically, a committed National Socialist, not merely a soldier who served because soldiers serve, but a true believer. After the war, he fled to Argentina as part of the Ratlins that allowed former Nazi officials and SS members to escape prosecution. He was associated in Argentina with other fugitives. He later returned to Germany, were his political activities, his associations with far-right organizations, his refusal to publicly condemn Nazism, his writing that glorified his combat record without adequate moral reckoning, kept him a deeply controversial figure until his death in 1982. The military historian must hold two truths simultaneously: that Rudel's combat record was genuine, extraordinary, and documented beyond any reasonable doubt, and that the cause he served was one of the most destructive criminal enterprises in human history. His skill in the cockpit cannot be separated from the strategic purpose it served. Every tank he destroyed was destroyed in service of a war of annihilation. Every mission was flown for a regime that was simultaneously operating extermination camps. Rudel himself, in his memoir Stuka Pilot, published in 1952, does not engage adequately with this reality. He writes about flying. He writes about duty and courage and comradeship. He does not write about what the state that decorated him was doing to human beings 100 miles from his airfield. This is the shadow that falls across his record. We do not have to choose between acknowledging what he achieved in the air and acknowledging what that achievement served. History is not a courtroom where we issue simple verdicts. History is more complex than that. Rudel was a man of extraordinary personal courage and physical capability who placed those gifts in the service of evil. Both things are true. Both things matter. What does remain, stripped of political context, is a purely physical and psychological record of what one human being accomplished, and what that record tells us about the limits, or perhaps the limitlessness, of human endurance. 2,530 combat missions. The number sits in the historical record like a monument to something that shouldn't be possible. No other pilot in any air force of any nation in any war comes close. The next highest totals: Erich Hartmann's 1,404 missions, Ivan Kozadub's 330 missions, are extraordinary achievements that, placed beside Rudel's number, somehow seem almost routine. He was shot down 30 times and survived each one. He was wounded 5 times, wounds that included shrapnel injuries, bullet wounds, and a catastrophic leg injury of February 1945. He destroyed 519 tanks. He sank a battleship. He flew on the day a leg was taken from him. He flew again 6 weeks after the amputation. When the war was over, when there was no more flying to be done, Rudel channeled his compulsive need for physical challenge into mountaineering and athletics. He competed in skiing competitions. He climbed mountains. He did these things on a prosthetic leg, with the same methodical, relentless, slightly terrifying dedication with which he had done everything else in his life. There's a medical concept called pain tolerance, the threshold at which physical sensation becomes unbearable and the body insists on stopping. Every human being has one. It is a survival mechanism. It exists because the body understands that some damage, if not stopped, is fatal, and it uses pain as a signal to retreat, to protect, to preserve. Hans-Ulrich Rudel appears to have had a pain tolerance that functioned by entirely different rules than those governing normal human physiology. Whether this was genetic, psychological, the product of his extraordinary physical conditioning, some interaction of all three, medicine cannot fully explain it. History can only record it. His aircraft, by the end of the war, had been hit by enemy fire over 500 times. He had gone through numerous aircraft, replacements for ones destroyed in crash landings, burned out by battle damage, written off by maintenance crews who could not repair them. Mechanics who worked on his aircraft described their job as essentially continuous repair. The aircraft came back damaged every time, and they fixed it every time, and he took it back up every time. His rear seat gunners, the men who sat behind him in the cramped rear cockpit, manning the defensive gun, watching the flak come up and the fighters swoop in, had a survival rate that was, to put it diplomatically, not encouraging. Several were killed while flying with Rudel. Some were wounded. His last regular gunner, the physician Ernst Gaterman, survived the war, partly through medical necessity. If Rudel was going to keep flying despite his wounds, someone with medical training needed to be in the aircraft behind him. There is something almost mythological about all of this, and mythology is precisely the problem. Myths flatten complexity. They turn human beings into archetypes: the warrior, the hero, the unstoppable force. And in doing so, they strip away the moral weight, the political context, the human cost of what the warrior was doing and for whom. The post-war far-right romanticization of Rudel, The treatment of his combat record as a kind of pure, apolitical testament to human excellence is intellectually dishonest. It serves an agenda. It uses Rudel's extraordinary physical capability to launder the ideology he served. But there's also something genuinely, uncomfortably instructive in his record. Not about ideology, not about war as a political tool, but about what the human body and mind can do when driven by absolute, uncompromising will. Rudel did not quit, ever, not once. In 4 years of continuous combat, in conditions of extraordinary physical and psychological stress, through wounds that would have ended any ordinary career, through the progressive collapse of everything he was fighting for, not once did he allow himself to stop. Whether this represents a virtue or a pathology probably depends on what you believe about human will and its relationship to conscience. A man who applies a degree of will to a cause of genuine justice might move mountains and save lives. A man who applies a degree of will in service of catastrophic evil does exactly what Rudel did, places his extraordinary gifts in service of destruction on an almost incomprehensible scale. The lesson of Hans-Ulrich Rudel is not that you should be like him. The lesson is more complex and more interesting than that. It is that human beings are capable of more than they imagine, of endurance, of will, of physical persistence. And that capability, divorced from moral purpose, from genuine human conscience, from the question of what exactly we are persisting toward and for whom, is not a virtue. It is a force. Forces can build and forces can destroy, and which they do depend entirely on the direction in which they are aimed. Rudel aimed his force where he aimed it. History has recorded the result. He died on December 18, 1982, in Rosenheim, Bavaria. He was 66 years old. To the end, he was physically vigorous, still climbing mountains, still insisting on athletic performance from a body that had absorbed more combat damage than any aircraft should have survived, let alone the human being inside it. At his funeral, several aging former Luftwaffe pilots came to pay their respects. There were also, uncomfortably, representatives of West German far-right political organizations. The German Bundeswehr, the modern German military, sent no official delegation. They had quietly retired his name from the list of historical figures officially honored by the institution. It was a careful, deliberate distancing, necessary, perhaps, but also a kind of historical erasure that neither fully honors the complexity of the record nor adequately addresses its moral dimension. The most decorated German serviceman in the history of the Second World War lies in a grave in Bavaria. His combat record stands in the history books, documented and verified by both German and Allied sources. His aircraft destroyed more enemy armor than any other single weapon system operated by a single individual in the war. He flew more missions than any pilot in the history of aerial warfare. He lost a leg and flew 500 more times. And the world he was fighting for, the 1,000-year empire, the racial hierarchy, the new order of National Socialism, lasted 12 years, ended in absolute ruin, and left behind it a toll in human suffering that staggers imagination. Extraordinary capability, catastrophic purpose. The two facts standing together, inseparable, in the historical record. That is the story of Hans-Ulrich Rudel. That is the story of the man they called a madman, because what he did in the air was mad and magnificent, and morally freighted beyond any simple accounting. And because history, when it is told honestly, is almost never simple. 2,530 missions, one leg, no surrender. Make of it what you will, but do not look away from it. To the viewer, from WW2 Ghost Wings. History does not always give us comfortable heroes. Sometimes it gives us men like Rudel, men who force us to think harder, feel more deeply, and refuse easy answers. And that discomfort, that refusal to look away from the full weight of what happened, is exactly what this channel is built to do. If this story made you think, if it challenged you, haunted you, or made you see the Second World War from an angle you hadn't considered before, please leave a like on this video. It takes 3 seconds, and it tells the algorithm that stories like this deserve to be seen. It keeps this channel alive and keeps these stories being told. Subscribe to WW2 Ghost Wings if you haven't already. We are building something here, a documentary archive of forgotten stories, the impossible missions, the men and women who lived through the most cataclysmic conflict in human history and left marks on the world that we are still living with today. Every subscriber matters. Every view matters. You are the reason this channel exists. And now we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below with this. Where you draw the line between honoring a warrior's capability and confronting the ideology he served. There is no single right answer. That is exactly why we want your thoughts. This community's conversations are as valuable as the scripts we write, and we read every single comment. Next time on WW2 Ghost Wings, we go somewhere completely different. A story from the Pacific. A target so heavily defended that American commanders quietly told the crews assigned to it that survival odds were below 15%. And the men climbed into their aircraft anyway. What drove them up those ladders and into those cockpits? That story is coming, and it will stay with you. Thank you, genuinely, deeply, for watching, for caring about history, for being part of this community. We will see you in the next one. WW2 Ghost Wings.